This video will provide instructions for exegetical exercise number 4, which involves forming interpretive questions. The entire enterprise of forming interpretive questions in the process of studying Scripture has been identified by at least one individual as the single most valuable enterprise of any sort of inductive work that you can do. That's a fairly large claim. I hope that when you reach the close of this article, this exercise, you'll begin to appreciate why one would make such a bold claim. Forming interpretive questions is the process of seeking to understand a passage so thoroughly that we have a sense of what is the primary message it's trying to get across. This approach operates from the assumption that documents were written intentionally. Pick up a document. It's not just a collection of random information, but it's designed to provide something specific. If, for example, you go to your mailbox, you open up a piece of mail that's telling you about a new vehicle that's for sale, you take one step back and say, what is the objective of this particular communication, this document? It is intended to make me attracted to the purchase of a particular vehicle. In view of that objective, then imagine yourself in a conversation with a document. If that's the document we're talking about, a car sale document, an advertisement, then the appropriate question would be, why in the world should I buy this vehicle and not something else? And then watch how that document seeks to answer that question, because that is the question it's hoping you will ask. Please lock in on that concept. A document is written for a purpose. It hopes that you will ask it questions that it's designed to answer. The same sort of approach could be used with regard to particular programming. For example, the evening news. If I sit down to the evening news, that particular programming is intended to answer particular questions. Primarily, what are the salient events that have gone on in my region or in the globe within the last 24 hours? If, on the other hand, I approach that same programming with the question, what's the most interesting constellation in the sky, I'm liable to come away with no information answering that question at all. A particular communication is designed to answer certain questions. When we figure out what those questions are, then those become our most important interpretive questions to direct to that particular communication. As you might deduce then, background to the process of interpretive questions, or at least tandem with it, is determining what's the central idea of a given communication. Now let's leave aside the analogies from advertising or the evening news and turn instead to Scripture itself. Consider the opening chapters of the Bible, the account of creation, Genesis 1 and 2. A principal question that's appropriate to ask of this passage is, who's behind all that we see and are a part of? Who's behind this? The text is ready to answer that question very definitively. God is behind all of this, and let me tell you how he did it. Very, very foundational is who's behind this. That sort of a question is a fairly simple, it's an open and closed sort of question. Quickly it can be posed, quickly it can be answered. End of story. We live with the implications of it, that is, that God's in charge of this universe as its originator, but a simple identity question is fairly quickly dispatched or answered. The sort of interpretive questions we want to move into will have more pondering involved in them. So, for example, consider the question that's offered as an example that you see on the screen before you. And what we're looking at here is a page from the syllabus for this course. And we have turned to the portion that outlines the exegetical exercises. We're focusing on exercise number 4, forming interpretive questions that are fundamental to the passage. Notice the italicized subtext over there on the far left column. What central question or questions does the text itself hope that we, the reader, will raise after we have studied this passage? And now for the example, which is given to you in column 3. You've seen this question already. You've encountered it in the course of this particular study back when we were looking at Genesis 3. And the interpretive question reads, why was a consequence so disproportionately severe as death the result following an infraction of disobedience, as opposed to reserving death for something of a larger infraction, such as perhaps murder? We're thinking here of the arrangement that God made where he said, if you eat from the fruit which I tell you not to eat of it, in that day you will die. The act was disobedience, the punishment, death. Why a punishment so severe? Fairly rapidly we can detect that this is a more question designed more for pondering. It's not simply asking who is responsible for the universe that we're in, but rather why did this particular reaction, death, follow the action, disobedience? Why was it not some downgraded reaction? Doesn't that seem a little too severe? While we're looking at the example, then let's continue to follow down the column, and you see the bold words, explanation of question's significance. I'll be asking you to not only indicate the passage, the focal verses from which your question arises, and then express your interpretive question, but follow it with an explanation of the question's significance. Let me see inside your thinking. Why is it that you fashioned that question? Why do you think it's a significant question? And what direction do you think the answer might go? How might one fruitfully respond to it? And as we study through that, then as we trace it out, the implications or the direction the answer might go, then we can better see how significant the question is, how important it is to consider it in the light of the given passage. Let me scroll this up just a bit and we'll see more fully the comment about explanation. So it's proposed here that asking about the disproportionate consequence, namely death, posing this interpretive question can lead one to realize that any rejection of God, such as is true in this case of disobedience, eating the fruit that was forbidden, any disobedience constitutes a rejection of the one who gave humanity life itself. And in the process of rejecting the life giver, this necessarily will result in death. Death is not so much the penalty of an angry God, but the chosen preference of a creature, someone who is created, who is determinedly and foolishly less interested in life, less interested in hanging on to God, more interested in hanging on to some temporarily pleasing piece of fruit that God has said, that's not for you. I trust you can see that in this explanation of the question's significance, then the writer has let the reader in on what's the thinking. Where does, of the crafter of the question, in this case you're the one crafting the question, and I'm the reader. You're letting me in on your thought process and helping me appreciate why you think that question could be significant. Let's scroll back down to look at the instructions once again. So what you'll be doing is focusing not on Genesis 3, but on 1 Samuel 13, 14, and 15. You're given 3 chapters to work with. This is the account involving Saul's monarchy. In particular, it will deal with an episode when Saul did not follow God's instruction. So what you want to do is study over those 3 chapters. Study them, read them carefully, get a sense of what seems to be the central idea in the text. Now, driving towards a central idea doesn't mean that that idea won't change later. In fact, sometimes the process of working up the interpretive questions will cause you to revise your central idea, but you want to be heading that direction. This also implies that in the background you would have already executed in your preparation for interpretive questions. You would have executed some of the preliminary steps, such as thinking about what genre. We're in the historical, we're in narrative genre, so we won't treat it as poetry. You want to be attentive to literary devices, something as basic as repetition. You would want to watch and see what repeated words or concepts are going on here. What are the dynamics of this passage? What seems to be important? And then sit down and begin to craft some interpretive questions. I'll be asking you to provide at least 4. If you want to go ahead and do 5, that's all right too. And here's a situation where I would encourage you to answer the questions as best you can. Go ahead and take the time, not just to fashion them, but to see what kind of answers will come up. Sometimes you'll want to, in this process, consult commentaries. Do that. That means that you'll map out your study period in such a fashion that you'll have time to go to a library if needed and access commentaries or solid Bible dictionaries in the case where an answer may lay beyond your field of reasoning or knowledge. In the process of developing interpretive questions, you may come up with as many as a dozen of them, of which only 4 or 5 will be really helpful. Really helpful. For example, let's go back to the Genesis 3 passage. One might ask the question concerning the forbidden fruit. What sort of tree was it that was forbidden? If you're at all familiar with the story, you'll quickly realize that the passage doesn't give that answer. Some people have erroneously, I remember a high school chum of mine, a brilliant student, was inclined to think that it was an apple, and he always felt guilty whenever he ate an apple. I wish that my friend had read the Bible a little more carefully. That would set him free from that fear which had no basis, because we don't know what kind of fruit it is. By the way, can you see what that tells us about the aim of the passage? It is not the aim of the passage to tell us which fruit was forbidden, so that perhaps later on we could do a little better job than Adam and Eve did and avoid that fruit. That is not something that the passage hopes that we will ask. If we ask, we will get no answer. The passage is uninterested in telling us which fruit was forbidden. So there is one question that we can come up with, but quickly it becomes a dead end, so we'll set it aside. Another question that we might come up with is, how is it that a snake can talk? Again, we're concentrating on the Genesis 3 passage as example. How is it that a snake can talk? So imagine yourself in conversation with the passage as if it were a person and say, all right, can you tell me about this? This captures my attention, and it's very puzzling. I'm not used to animals talking. It's very strange. And once again, we would be getting a blank stare from the passage as if it were treated as a person. It's not interested in telling us about how animals can talk. That is, for the purpose of the story, that's a given, which tells us the passage is interested in us pursuing something else. What would it be? And it's not necessarily just one other thing, but it wants us to go in another direction. It's eager to disclose information, but so far, what kind of fruit it is, why is it that an animal can talk, it's not so concerned about that. Perhaps instead then we should be asking questions like, how does this interaction between Adam and Eve and the serpent, how does this affect their relationship with God? Now the text would like to disclose some answers to things like that. And it's within that train of thought that this question, why does death become a consequence of disobedience? It's in that train that this question is related. The point of these last few minutes then was to indicate that as you begin to generate questions, you will undoubtedly come up with a host of questions which are frankly tangential and irrelevant to the passage. Don't let that frustrate you. Just anticipate you'll probably have to come up with a dozen or 15 questions from your study in 1 Samuel 13 to 15 before you're able to sort them out and come up with perhaps 3 or 4 or 5, at least 4 please, 4 questions that are really keepers, that really go for gold. They go to the depth of the message of the passage. And that's what's meant by the instruction there in the second column from the left. Discard questions which are peripheral. So use your judgment. I'm not interested in seeing those on your assignment. Just discard them. But only keep those that the text is really concerned about engaging. Questions that are not dead-end questions, but rather ones that are fundamental, that strike at the central thrust of the passage. And then after having settled on those, give a brief explanation why you think it qualifies, that question qualifies as a truly significant question arising from the given passage. Perhaps you're thinking to yourself, well, am I allowed to pose questions which are not explicitly answered by the passage? Go back to Genesis 1 and 2. Who's responsible for this world, this cosmos we find ourselves in? That one is explicitly answered, isn't it? And frankly, it's important, but it doesn't move us into a lot of reflection unless we ask something like, what is the significance of the fact that God is responsible for developing, for creating this cosmos we find ourselves in? If we ask questions of what's the significance of, then that can open it up a bit farther. In the case of the model question from Genesis 3, you'll notice that the answer is not explicit in the passage. Why was death the consequence of disobedience? That's not explicit. It takes some thinking. And in that thinking, as long as our thinking is consistent with information we're given in the passage, it's that thinking then that begins to break open the light of illumination and insight that can yield spiritually fruitful teaching or principles from the passage. All that to say, when you pose an interpretive question, it's not essential that the answer be explicit in the passage. It may be implicit. It may be implicit in the passage, and that's okay. That's very, very acceptable. Here's a template that you're welcome to use. In fact, I would encourage you to use as you carry out this assignment. You'll find it's included with the material of this particular video as a downloadable piece, or you can just study this and type it out in similar fashion. So please use this pattern, this template, as you carry out exegetical exercise number 4, developing 4 or up to 5 interpretive questions from 1 Samuel 13 through 15. What you'll do in each case is indicate what are the focal verses for the given question that you're proposing. That won't be all 3 chapters, but please make it easy for me as a reader to focus in on which particular verses have given rise to your question. Now, your question might cover a large span. Maybe it won't be just 1 or 2 adjacent verses, but maybe it'll be over 3 or 4 paragraphs, some behavior of characters there that are typified, that are described, that you want me to pay attention to, and that's fine. And then articulate the question, my question is, and state your question, and then follow it by your own reflection about why that question is significant. Why is it more than just a superficial or a dead-end question? Why is this something that seems to go to the heart of the central message of this text? It's not necessary to have a cover page for this assignment. The presence of your name at the top is adequate. Earlier I mentioned that I encourage you to trace out the answers to your questions. You do not need to disclose all those answers in this assignment. Some of the evidence of your having reflected on those answers will inevitably come up in your portion that explains the question's significance in each case. Some of the fact that you have thought through where that question might lead, that'll be evident from your significance, your explanation statements. but it's not necessary to append another paragraph for each question saying, here is the answer. Similarly, it's not necessary to provide footnotes for dictionaries, theological dictionaries, or commentaries that you've consulted. That's not necessary. If you wish to, that's fine. That's good evidence of the fact that you've been thorough. But if you have a really strong question and you can argue that, you can defend it by indicating its significance, those two pieces, together with indicating the focal verses from which it arises, those pieces will be sufficient for this assignment. I hope you have a fruitful time. Keep in mind that some have said nothing is quite so generating of fruit in the study of a passage as learning to ask good and perceptive interpretive questions. It is an art. It is an art. This is something that I've been working at for years. I commend it to you. It can be very, very valuable as you study a passage and then use it as food for your own soul and then seek to present it to people in a flock or some group of believers that you're seeking to move forward in their growth in maturation in Christ.